It began with a sound no one in that mansion would ever forget. A sharp, tearing sound that sliced through the stillness like a scream no one dared to answer. The air itself seemed to stop breathing. The chandelier above trembled with the echo of it. Standing there, frozen beside a silver tray, was a young black maid named Grace. Her eyes were wide, her lips trembling, her shoulder bare where her uniform had been ripped apart. The delicate fabric dangled from her arm, threads torn like the dignity that once held her together. Before her stood Victoria Hensley, the millionaire's wife, elegant, cruel, and shaking with a fury she didn't understand. Her diamond ring glinted as her hand hovered in the air, trembling not with fear, but with pride wounded by jealousy. "What did you say to my husband?" Victoria hissed. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough venom to stain the air between them. Grace's lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat locked with disbelief. She hadn't said anything to Ethan, not beyond the polite words of a maid doing her job. But Victoria's mind had already decided. The silence only fueled her rage. "Answer me," she demanded. Grace's gaze lifted for a moment, not in defiance but in confusion, toward the grand staircase where portraits of the Hensley ancestors looked down. Men in fine suits, women in pearls, watching as if history itself had never changed. Victoria saw that look and mistook it for arrogance. "Don't you dare look at me like that," she spat. Then she snatched the silver tray from Grace's shaking hands and flung it across the marble floor. The sound of crashing glass echoed through the hall like thunder. Forks and knives spun across the tiles. The reflection of the chandelier shattered into 1,000 trembling lights. Grace bent down, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the broken pieces. Her fingers bled where the shards cut through her skin, small red drops mixing with the shine of spilled wine. She whispered, "Yes, ma'am," her voice soft, steady, but trembling beneath the surface like a leaf in wind. The other servants hid behind doors, peeking from shadows. None dared to speak. They knew how it went when money met rage. The walls seemed to breathe, heavy with a silence that begged to be broken. Victoria stood above Grace, chest heaving. "You people," she said, her voice cracking between superiority and something more fragile, fear. "You people think you can climb your way into anything. You forget where you belong." Grace didn't answer. She just kept gathering the shards, one by one, like she was piecing her soul back together. Her reflection flickered in the silver, pale and sad. And then came the footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Each step louder than the last. Ethan Hensley entered from his study, tall, composed, the weight of wealth in his posture. His face was calm at first, too calm, until he saw what was in front of him. The ripped uniform. The bleeding hand. The way Grace's shoulders trembled though she refused to cry. "What happened here?" His voice carried authority, but beneath it, there was something else, disbelief. Victoria straightened instantly, her tone softening as if trying to cover the cruelty with charm. "Your maid got out of line, Ethan," she said quickly. "I only meant to correct her." Grace stayed silent, eyes on the floor. Ethan's gaze drifted to the shredded fabric, then to her trembling hand. He noticed the blood, the bruise beginning to form near her shoulder. His jaw tightened. The chandelier's light caught the moisture in his eyes before he blinked it away. He turned to his wife. "You did this." Victoria hesitated. "Ethan," she. But he didn't look at her. His eyes remained on Grace. And for the first time, she looked back at him, just for a second, and he saw it. The quiet humiliation. The patience that came from years of swallowing pain. The kind of strength money could never buy. Something unspoken passed between them, a truth both of them had ignored for too long. Victoria's voice cracked the silence again. "Ethan, don't make this dramatic. It's not what it looks like." He didn't answer. His silence was worse than anger. It filled the hallway like judgment itself. He slowly walked closer to Grace. "You're hurt," he said softly. She shook her head, clutching her arm. "It's nothing, sir." Victoria rolled her eyes. "Don't play victim, Grace. If you'd just done as I asked." "Victoria." Ethan's voice was firm now. She froze mid-sentence. The servants behind the doors went still. He turned to her with a calmness that scared her more than shouting ever could. "Go upstairs." "What?" she said, forcing a laugh. "Ethan, I said, go upstairs." Something in his tone made even the walls seem to pull back. Victoria took a step backward, pride warring with fear. She glanced at Grace, who stood there clutching her torn sleeve, face bowed. Then, with a scoff and a swirl of silk, Victoria walked away. Her heels clicked like hammers of guilt on the marble floor. The moment she disappeared, Ethan turned to Grace again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Grace blinked, confused. "You don't need to apologize, sir." But he did. Not just for his wife. For everything that silence had allowed to grow in that house. For every unspoken cruelty that wealth had buried under manners and money. He wanted to speak, but the words refused to come. Grace only nodded once, turned, and began to walk away, her steps small but steady. The torn uniform swayed behind her like a flag, a quiet reminder of the war that had just been declared inside that home. Ethan watched her go, the sound of her soft footsteps echoing against the marble. He felt something stir, not attraction, not pity, but shame. The kind that comes when a man finally sees the mirror he's been avoiding his whole life. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the same silence. It carried the weight of what had just happened, a line crossed, a truth revealed. Victoria's perfume still lingered in the air, but underneath it, there was the faint scent of something purer, humility, maybe, or the start of it. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, howling like the world itself was trying to tell them something. Ethan turned toward the grand staircase, where the portraits watched in eternal judgment. For the first time, he didn't see proud ancestors. He saw ghosts. Ghosts of every person who'd ever been stepped on so someone else could stand taller. And somewhere deep inside him, something shifted, the beginning of guilt, or maybe redemption. In that frozen moment, the story hadn't yet unfolded. But it had begun, with a sound. The sound of a uniform tearing. The sound of pride breaking. The sound of a man realizing that money couldn't fix what his silence had allowed. Because some lines, once crossed, can never be unseen. The morning after the tear, the mansion felt colder than it ever had before. The halls, once echoing with soft music and the quiet footsteps of staff, now pulsed with whispers. Whispers that moved like ghosts between the rooms. Every servant knew. Every maid, every butler, they all knew what Madame had done. But no one dared speak above a breath. Because in a house where money ruled, truth was the one thing that couldn't be afforded. Grace moved through the silence with her head lowered, her step small, her right arm wrapped in a white bandage hidden beneath her sleeve. The wound on her shoulder had stopped bleeding, but the wound in her heart hadn't. Every movement stung, not from pain but from shame. She'd spent the night sitting by the small window in her quarters, looking out into the garden where morning dew rested on rose petals. She'd prayed quietly, not for revenge, but for the strength to endure another day in a house that treated her like invisible furniture. Downstairs, Ethan Hensley sat at the long mahogany dining table, a newspaper untouched beside his plate. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't care. His mind was somewhere else, replaying the image of Grace standing in the hall, her uniform ripped, her dignity in pieces. He couldn't unsee it. He couldn't unhear the sound of fabric tearing. Victoria swept into the room, radiant as ever, dressed in white silk like nothing had happened. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice smooth, cheerful, the kind of cheer that sounds rehearsed. He looked up slowly. "Morning." She poured herself a glass of orange juice and laughed softly. "You're quiet. Still upset about last night?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on her hand, the same hand that had grabbed and torn. "I'm trying to understand it," he said finally. "Why you did that to her." Victoria set her glass down with a sigh. "Oh, Ethan, please. Don't make a tragedy out of nothing." She was being insolent. "You know how emotional these girls can be. They're dramatic. I was only trying to discipline her." The word discipline struck him like a slap. He leaned forward slowly, his tone calm but his voice lower now. "By ripping her uniform off?" Victoria froze, her smile fading. "Ethan, don't start moralizing. You don't understand what it's like to manage people like her. They get ideas if you're too soft. People like her, he repeated quietly. What does that mean? She laughed awkwardly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Oh, come on. Don't twist my words. You know what I mean. But he didn't smile. He couldn't. The way she said, these people, lingered like poison in the air. Across the room, Grace entered quietly to collect the empty dishes. Her presence made Victoria's face tighten. Grace moved carefully, eyes down, never speaking unless spoken to. When she reached for a plate near Ethan, her sleeve slipped slightly, revealing the edge of the bandage. Ethan noticed. His jaw clenched. Victoria did too. And something ugly flashed in her eyes, the same insecurity that had sparked the cruelty the night before. Be careful with that, she said coldly. You break another plate, and you'll pay for it out of your wages. Grace nodded softly. Yes, ma'am. Ethan stood suddenly, chair scraping the floor. That's enough, he said. Victoria blinked. Excuse me. He turned to Grace. You can go. Grace looked confused. Sir. It's all right, he said gently. You can go. She bowed her head, set the plate down, and walked out quickly. Victoria folded her arms. You're coddling her, she said. Do you know how many of them would kill to have a job here? Ethan looked at her, his face unreadable. Maybe that's the problem. The rest of breakfast was silent. By afternoon, the gossip had spread through every corner of the estate. In the kitchen, the maids whispered while chopping vegetables. Did you see her arm? One said. She didn't even fight back. Another shook her head. Because fighting never helps. They don't see us as people anyway. Grace stayed quiet, her hand steady as she cleaned the silverware. She had learned long ago that silence was her shield, that humility could hide strength better than pride ever could. But when she went to her small room that night, she pulled out a photo of her son, an 8-year-old boy with a shy smile and eyes that reminded her of his father. Her husband had died working one of Ethan's factories years ago. The memory still stung, but she'd accepted the job at the mansion because it was stable, honest work. Or at least she'd thought so. The irony wasn't lost on her. She worked in the home of the man whose company had taken her husband's life. And now his wife had taken her dignity too. The next evening, a dinner party was held at the Hensley mansion. Crystal glasses. Candles. Wealthy guests in black suits and sparkling gowns. Grace and the staff moved like shadows, silent and efficient. Victoria glowed in her element, all smiles and laughter, sipping wine as though cruelty never lived behind her lips. And then it happened. As the laughter grew louder, Victoria's eyes found Grace serving near the fireplace. The look she gave her was sharp, cold, a warning. Grace, she called out sweetly. The room went quiet. Do tell everyone why you were crying the other day. Did you think my husband would save you? A few guests chuckled softly, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Grace froze. Her throat tightened, her hands trembling. The tray in her grip wobbled slightly. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry, ma'am, she whispered, eyes on the floor. Victoria smirked. Oh, come now. Don't be shy. We all know maids get attached. Laughter this time, louder, crueler. Grace blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. And then, a chair scraped back. Ethan stood up slowly, his face unreadable but his voice like iron. That's enough, Victoria. The room went dead silent. Victoria turned, stunned. Ethan, it's just a joke. He didn't move. Apologize to her. Her jaw dropped. What? I said apologize to her. No. The guests stared, mouths half open, eyes darting between husband and wife. Victoria's voice trembled with disbelief. You're defending her? In front of everyone? Ethan's eyes never left hers. Yes. Because you just insulted the only person in this house who still remembers what respect looks like. The tension was unbearable. No one breathed. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered, but no one looked. Victoria's face burned with humiliation. She stood abruptly, her chair tipping behind her. Without a word, she stormed out, her heels clicking down the marble hall. The silence she left behind was louder than any scream. Grace stood frozen, her chest heaving with confusion and fear. She had never seen a man like Ethan look at her that way, not with pity, but with something close to recognition. The servants in the doorway exchanged glances. The wealthy guests looked anywhere but at each other. Ethan sat back down slowly, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't say another word. Grace bowed her head and whispered softly, "Thank you, sir." He nodded once, barely looking at her. "You deserve better than this, Grace." And though the party continued that night, something in that mansion had broken beyond repair. The air was heavy with what could not be undone. The next morning, the laughter was gone. The flowers on the table had wilted overnight. And somewhere deep inside the house, both Grace and Ethan knew, silence would no longer keep the peace. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently into the mansion, but the warmth didn't touch the air. Everything inside was cold, distant. The servants whispered like ghosts, moving carefully so as not to disturb the tension that hung heavy over every room. No one dared look at Maya. No one dared look at the master's study. Eleanor hadn't come downstairs. Not since last night. Not since the moment the truth began to show itself. Maya had barely slept. Her hands trembled as she stood by the kitchen window, folding napkins that didn't need folding. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Just tired. Tired of being seen as less. Tired of pretending her silence was dignity when it was really survival. Then came the sound. The slow, deliberate footsteps. Richard. He stood in the doorway, still in the same clothes as last night, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his eyes red but sharp. He said nothing for a moment, just watched her. The way she stood. The way she avoided his gaze. "Maya," he said finally. Her name came out quieter than a whisper but heavier than thunder. She turned, uncertain. "Sir." He took a deep breath and looked down, at the faint tear in her uniform, where Eleanor had ripped it apart. His hand clenched. "Did she do this to you?" There it was. The question she had waited her whole life to hear, not from him, but from anyone who saw her pain and didn't look away. Maya hesitated, then nodded, softly. Something inside Richard broke. The silence in the room fractured. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse. Instead, he walked toward her, each step echoing with the weight of realization. He stopped only a few feet away. "I saw you holding our son that night," he said quietly. "He was crying, and you were the only one who knew how to calm him. You sang to him, didn't you?" She blinked, startled. I did, sir. Only because he couldn't sleep. And yet my wife tore your clothes apart for doing what she herself could not, for caring." The words burned in his throat. His face turned pale. "How long?" he asked. "How long has she treated you like this?" Maya wanted to say it didn't matter, that she was used to it. But something in his eyes, the raw guilt, the awakening, made her speak. "Since the beginning, sir. I didn't want to trouble you. I just wanted peace." Peace. That word cut him deeper than anger ever could. For years, he had built empires, fought rivals, negotiated deals worth millions. But he had missed the war happening under his own roof, the war between arrogance and humanity. He sat down slowly, like a man realizing the weight of his own blindness. "Maya," he said, voice breaking, "I need to tell you something. Last night, I almost didn't come home. I was at a dinner meeting, and someone asked me, 'What's the one thing money can't buy?' I laughed. I said, 'Time.' But I was wrong. It's decency. It's kindness. And I came home and saw exactly what happens when you forget that." Maya didn't speak. Her eyes shimmered, but she stayed still. Then Richard looked toward the stairs. His tone hardened. "She's upstairs, isn't she?" Maya's lips parted slightly. "Please, sir. Don't." But it was too late. He was already walking. Upstairs, the master bedroom was a kingdom of luxury. Marble, velvet, gold. Eleanor stood before the mirror, brushing her hair, wearing the calm of a woman who believed she had won. The door opened without warning. "Eleanor." She turned, startled by the voice, not because it was loud, but because it was steady. "Richard," she said softly, "you look dreadful. Are you still upset about that maid?" Really, darling, you shouldn't let these people. These people. His tone sliced through her words. He took another step closer. You ripped her clothes, Eleanor. In front of our son. She froze, the brush in her hand trembling slightly. She was out of line. That woman has no respect. She showed more respect to this family than you have in years. His voice cracked. Do you even hear yourself anymore? Eleanor's expression hardened. You're defending her? A servant. I'm defending decency. His words thundered across the room. You think money gives you permission to humiliate someone who's done nothing but serve us with grace? Silence. The kind that feels like lightning before the storm. Eleanor scoffed, masking her fear with pride. She's manipulating you. You don't know these people, Richard. They pretend to be loyal until... Until what? He demanded. Until they show us what humanity looks like. The room went dead still. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do you even realize our son watched you tear that woman's clothes? What lesson did you teach him, Eleanor? That power is a weapon. Eleanor's lips quivered. You're humiliating me. No, Richard said quietly. You did that to yourself. He turned away. Pack your things. Her eyes widened. You can't mean... I do. He faced her again, his gaze colder now. You've humiliated the one person in this house who still remembers what kindness means. Until you can understand that, you won't live under this roof. Eleanor stepped back as though struck. You're choosing her over me? I'm choosing what's right, he said. Downstairs, Maya stood frozen at the sound of raised voices, her hands pressed against her chest. She heard footsteps, heavy, final. And then Eleanor came storming down, eyes blazing, dragging a suitcase. She shot Maya a look of venom but didn't speak. Moments later, Richard appeared. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of regret and resolve. He walked up to Maya slowly. You're not invisible anymore, he said softly. Not in this house. Not ever again. And for the first time in years, Maya's knees gave way, not from fear, but from release. He caught her before she fell. There, in the middle of the mansion's marble floor, a maid wept quietly while the master of the house finally understood what power was supposed to mean. Not control. Not dominance. But responsibility. Outside, the morning light broke through the clouds. And in that fragile sunlight, the mansion no longer felt like a prison. It felt like truth, finally revealed. The world hadn't changed yet. But something inside him had. And that was the beginning of everything that would come next. Days passed. The mansion, once echoing with laughter, guests, and the subtle hum of high society, had fallen silent. The air was lighter, cleaner somehow, as if the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. But silence has a sound when it follows chaos, the sound of realization, of change, of something awakening inside a man who had lived blind for too long. Richard spent most of his time alone now. Not in the study, not with contracts or meetings, but walking. Walking through the gardens that Maya once kept spotless without being noticed. Walking past the servants who once lowered their heads, but now met his eyes with quiet respect. Each step he took was a conversation with his own conscience. He remembered Maya's trembling voice. The way she said she just wanted peace. That sentence replayed in his mind like a sermon. One afternoon, as the golden hour painted the walls, he stood at the nursery door, watching his son play. The little boy looked up, smiling, and said, "Daddy, where's Miss Maya? I miss her songs." The question hit Richard harder than any insult ever could. His son, the heir to everything, missed the woman his wife had called just a maid. Richard knelt beside him. "She's still here, son. And soon, you'll hear her sing again." That night, he made a decision. Not for image, not for guilt, but for truth. He called everyone in the household, every servant, every guard, every worker who had ever been afraid to speak. They gathered in the grand hall, unsure, whispering. Maya stood among them, still humble, still in her repaired uniform. Richard stood before them, not as a master, but as a man stripped of excuses. His voice was quiet but carried through the room. "I owe every one of you an apology," he began. "For years, I believed respect was something earned by wealth, not by how you treat those who have less. I was wrong. My wife humiliated one of you, tore her dignity in front of everyone, and I said nothing. I was a coward." The servants glanced at each other. No one had ever heard him speak like this. He turned to Maya. "You didn't deserve any of it. You've shown more grace, strength, and humanity than the people who claimed to have power. From this day forward, you're not a maid in this house. You're the head of staff. You'll run this home, not as a servant, but as its heart." Maya's eyes widened. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," he replied gently. "You've already said enough through your kindness." And then something happened no one expected. Richard turned toward the staff and said, "If anyone here has ever been mistreated, you will speak freely from now on. This house will never again be a place of fear." A tear slipped down Maya's cheek. The others stood straighter, their silence breaking into relief. It was as if a chain that had held them for years had suddenly fallen away. Later that evening, Richard sat on the terrace with his son asleep in his arms. The stars shimmered above, distant but alive. Maya stepped out quietly to bring him tea. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "For me." He looked up at her, tired but peaceful. "I didn't do it for you, Maya. I did it because of you. Because you reminded me what being human means." There was a long silence between them, the kind that speaks more than words ever could. Then, almost as if on instinct, Maya said, "People like me, we don't expect kindness from people like you." Richard shook his head. "Then people like me have been living wrong." From inside, the sound of the clock chimed softly. Midnight. A new day. A new start. As days turned into weeks, the mansion began to change. The staff laughed again. The walls, once heavy with hierarchy, now carried warmth. Even the garden bloomed brighter, as if nature itself had forgiven the house. One morning, a letter arrived. It was from Eleanor. She had moved into one of their city apartments. Her tone was cold, defensive, but beneath it was something else, guilt. She asked if she could see their son. Richard agreed, but only under one condition. She must apologize to Maya first. And so, a week later, she returned. Dressed elegantly, but with eyes that no longer held arrogance, only shame. When Eleanor walked in, Maya froze. The air between them was thick with unspoken history. Eleanor took a breath and said, "Maya, I was cruel. I was wrong. I let my insecurities turn into hate. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say I'm sorry." Maya's voice trembled. "You don't owe me words, ma'am. You owe yourself peace." Eleanor nodded, eyes wet. "Maybe this is how I start." As she left, Richard watched from the doorway, holding his son. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel divided. Later that evening, he found Maya standing by the window, watching the sunset. "You could leave if you wanted to," he said softly. "Start somewhere new." She smiled faintly. "No, sir. This house isn't just yours anymore. It's ours, all of us. I'll stay, until it feels like home for everyone." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll make sure it does." The final rays of sunlight flooded the hall, painting the walls in gold. And for the first time, the house didn't shimmer because of money, but because of something purer, humanity restored. As the narrator's voice would echo in the black voice's tone, "Sometimes, the ones the world calls small are the ones who remind us what greatness really means. Dignity isn't bought. It's earned, not by power, but by how you treat those who have none." And so, the mansion that once witnessed cruelty became a symbol of redemption, proof that even the coldest hearts can find warmth again. Because kindness, once awakened, never dies. It only waits for someone brave enough to listen.